You'd be shocked at what you would find in some of these books of history, books of seerah, books of biography, books of hadith. You know, they start when the Prophet was young and they tell you the story how his heart was taken out by a devil. He was possessed. Sometimes he would have his wife Aisha ride on his back so she can go and see a game, a match. This is the greatest messenger of God. Imagine him coming out, carrying his wife, you know, on his back, carrying her like a baby, and she's watching a match. Who does this? These were efforts to defame the Prophet. You have hadiths, you know, in these hadith books that say the Prophet would stand in a public area and he would, God forbid, urinate. This is not the Prophet that we follow. But this is what Bani Umayyah did to defame the Prophet, that he was under a spell. There's a hadith in Bukhari that someone successfully put a spell on the Prophet, under the spell of the magic. And you have a number of such traditions. So we know that we have a problem when it comes to the history of the Prophet. We have some hadiths, you know, in these books that say the Prophet forgot some verses in Surah An-Najm and he added his own verse because the shaitan fooled him. Instead of thinking that this is Jibreel giving me the revelation, instead of knowing that shaitan, you know, was giving him the revelation, he thought it was Jibreel. And so he added a verse in the Quran. Then Jibreel came down, he rebuked him and he had to apologize. What kind of a prophet is this? And these hadiths still exist in our books. Is this respect for the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Or when you look at some historical events like the issue of Bani Qurayza, that the Prophet massacred 950 Jews. Is this accurate or no? That same surah, An-Najm, tells us, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. Anything the Prophet says is revelation from Allah. Yet you still find such hadiths in books. Yazid and Muawiyah, they harbored this resentment towards the Prophet because the Prophet ﷺ, he brought this religion and many of their forefathers were killed, you know, at Badr and some of these other events. So they realized that in Mecca we had power as pagans, we controlled society. Now this man came and he changed the social fabric and he brought this new religion and there's a new power structure. So they had this resentment towards the Prophet. That's number one. Number two, they wanted to justify their own position. Because if the Prophet is clearly infallible and he never makes a mistake and you're sitting in his seat representing the Prophet, people will tell you, wait a minute, you Yazid, you Muawiyah, you other caliphs, you're making all these mistakes, you're coming with all these sins. How are you qualified to represent the Prophet? What was their justification? The Prophet himself used to make mistakes sometimes. So if my Prophet makes mistakes, I can make mistakes, I can sit in his seat and represent him. It was an effort to justify their own wrong. Because see, what's special about Imam Ali alayhi salam when it comes to the caliphs? Imam Ali was the only one. From day one, he never committed any vice. All the others were pagans. They worshipped the idols. They would drink. They would do all these vices. So when you would tell them that, they're like, well, the Prophet, the same thing. Before his ba'tha, before he became officially a messenger, he would do these things. See, it's all an effort to justify their wrong and to make themselves qualified. They're like, if the Prophet whom God chose had such a history, we can have a similar history. So it was really an effort to justify their own wrong. The Bani Umayyah, one reason why they forged these, you know, fake hadiths about the Prophet, and they would pay some companions to forge them, is to justify their own position. Abu Hurairah, for example, he was definitely employed by the governments of his time to fabricate some hadiths. Another reason that we find here, and this is a very important reason, and this is a common theme when it comes to all of our sciences, science of hadith, science of Islamic law. After the Holy Prophet ﷺ, those who came to power, they imposed a ban on the recording of the hadith. For about 100 years, until the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, there was a ban on recording the hadith. No one was allowed to record the hadith. In fact, they would punish the one who would write the hadith and document it. The first and second caliphs after the Prophet, according to Sunni sources, they gathered the hadith of the Prophet and they burned it. Why? For what purpose? Their excuse, their justification was that we don't want people to be busy with hadith and forget the Quran and confuse the two. Let people focus on the Quran, so let's prevent and prohibit the people from recording the hadith. That was their excuse. Now for 100 years you had a gap. Nothing was really being recorded except some personal, individual, minor efforts. Now those people who came later to document the Prophet's life, to write his biography, they had no sources. They could only depend on what? On oral transmissions. The first book of seerah that we have by Ibn Ishaq, we'll discuss that shortly, came about 80 years after the Prophet. 80 years. The first books of seerah really came about 80 years after the Prophet. What happened in these 80 years? They had no concrete hadiths to refer to, historical evidence. You would go and just ask people, you know, the progeny of the Sahaba, the children of the Sahaba. You know, what did you hear from your parents? It was all orally transmitted. And that opened the door for all these fabrications, because when you don't have something documented on paper, you could easily change it, give it a different version, right? With oral transmission, you have a lot of changes. Have you ever heard of Chinese whispers? Mm-hmm. Right? Or they call it the game of telephone here. You know, in one room, even if you don't want to just play, you really want to be accurate. And this happens to you. You say something to your friend says it to someone else. When it comes back to you, you're like, oh my God, you know, you guys changed what I said to you. That's not what I said. Well, imagine in 80 years, you're relying on oral transmission. How many changes happened to that? It was the jealousy from the Ahlul Bayt, from the Prophet, from Imam Ali alayhi salam. You know, one of the main reasons why many of those companions did not accept the leadership of Imam Ali was this jealousy. So yes, it was passed down from generation to another, and then you had these different factors that we also mentioned. And hence, honestly, until this very day, we don't have an accurate biography of the Prophet. We don't. Something that is so comprehensive and accurate that we can fully trust, we don't have because of these circumstances.